Hi, my name is Simon Dawson, and welcome to this next video on my Switching View YouTube channel. This video series is all about what I'm calling queer ministry. And by queer ministry, I mean that very common worldwide phenomenon where people with gender variant or homoerotic lives or behaviours seem to be associated with spirituality in some way, as priests or shaman or counsellors or whatever. The first video in the series was a study of patriarchy, described how in patriarchal cultures where men are dominant, then queer ministry lives tend to be suppressed in some way. In this second video, I'll describe how societies that aren't patriarchal are very different. It will often be the case that spiritual leaders who are gender variant or display homoerotic lives or behaviours are welcomed and affirmed for what they bring to the cultures they live within. And I'll be looking at examples of this welcome and affirmation right across history and right across the world. I want to start our survey of queer ministry across the world by looking at shamanism and specifically Siberian shamanism. Being pedantic, the word shaman should only be used to describe the spiritual practices of the peoples of Siberia. But this is a spiritual phenomenon that's found right across the world, so the word shamanism is more commonly used to describe this worldwide practice. As for what is a shaman, it's a spiritual functionary who uses trance, transcendence or altered states of consciousness and travels mentally or spiritually to other worlds or other realms of consciousness to retrieve a lost soul, a sort of healing ritual, escort a deceased soul to the afterlife, or to communicate with a deity or spirit. A shaman can help his or her community in various ways as a healer, a guide of souls, intercessor, diviner, magic worker, or a teacher, and shaman frequently work with animal and spirit helpers. Whilst all sorts of men and women were able to become shaman, it's clear from the historical records that a significant number of these were what I'm calling intermediate type people, involved in some way with a gender variant or homoerotic identity or behaviour. This is one case study to show what I'm talking about. It comes from Kamchatka Peninsula, northeast Russia, recorded about 1900. I won't slow down the video by reading the full text. I'll talk through the bullet points to let you pause the video if you want to read the text for yourself. Here we have a young man who has a male sex, acquires what looks like a female gender identity. He imagines himself to be a woman, but also acquires a female gender role, female domestically, and a female role in marriage. But also this new role is linked to shamanship. It's a total change, abandoning the tools of his male trade, and acquires the behaviour, the speech, and the habits of a young woman. This marriage is a proper marriage, not ritual or symbolic. Many of these marriages last for a lifetime, and some reports say that to be the husband of a shaman is an honoured and sought after position. As for how a person decides to become a gender variant shaman, for some people their vocation is recognised when young by parents or the wider community, and the young person is helped to follow a well-recognised pattern as they grew up. Others made the choice for themselves, the choice often presented as a dream or spiritual visitation. This report is from Omaha, North America. These choices mostly happen at puberty or reaching adulthood, but there are reports of men acting as a much respected warrior or hunter for many years, and then in midlife choosing to change, destroying their bow and hunting tools, and moving into the tents with the women. I've only got time in this video to record a few short case studies, but there are a huge number of reports like this from all over the world. And in the documentation linked to this video on my website, I'll give you links to various books and websites so you can find out more for yourself and read these fascinating stories. Before we leave this introduction to shamanism and queer ministry, there's one more thing to talk about, which is to look at this whole idea of transcendence and altered states of consciousness, a key part of understanding shamanism. If we're not careful, we may unconsciously apply ideas about transcendence which come to us from Western Christian cultures, which is fine when looking at a Christian faith, but it may not be appropriate when looking at shamanism and these indigenous cultures. So what I want to do is slightly broaden out our ideas as to what transcendence may or can be. There's quite a famous book by Eliade titled Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. It describes all the methods that shaman can use to create these altered states of consciousness. There's also a superb book called Dancing in the Streets, A History of Collective Joy, which discusses how music and dance can create these profound experiences of collective ecstasy and union, both in tribal cultures or in the present day. My first problem is this: whilst I like the books, I'm not keen on the word ecstasy. That always seems to imply something always bold and dramatic and loud. And these experiences can be that, but they can also be quiet and private and personal. So I prefer the word transcendence rather than ecstasy, which can have that quiet, private meaning. In fact, both words have similar etymology. If ecstasy is standing outside oneself, transcend means to climb beyond. This is my second issue. There can be in Christianity a sense of climbing upwards towards God, a ladder of perfection, a vertical up-down relationship. And often this is a personal, individual process. But in some of these indigenous spiritualities, there's more of a horizontal idea, reaching outwards and not upwards, reaching out beyond yourself into the community, a collective, not an individual process. Perhaps in rites of initiation or other collective bonding, when you make profound spiritual connections with others within your community. And there's a connection with the divine, but that connection is mediated through this connection with other people in the ritual. So transcendence can be a collective, not an individual process. And that's probably why the book on ecstatic dance is called Collective Joy. The third and final issue is to look at what Eliade called the techniques of ecstasy, and what I'm calling the techniques of transcendence, the methods that the shaman used to induce these transcendent experiences within their community. The first two techniques are straightforward and well known: the use of psychoactive substances and the use of music and dance. These techniques are used right across the shamanic world in history and are widespread in modern shamanism today. The third technique is more problematic: the use of sexual and erotic texts, techniques and rituals to create transcendence. The Christian Church, which valued celibacy, had a real problem with this idea of sexuality within religion. It suppressed these acts and cultures wherever found, and often labelled it prostitution. I think because of this long suppression, the idea that the sexual and erotic can be a path towards the divine is quite strange to many people in the West nowadays. But the idea is there. It's important we pay attention to it. The sexual and the erotic can be used as a technique of transcendence alongside the use of plants, music and dance. That's all it is, no more and no less as an idea. The problem with all three techniques is that they can bring up a bit of moral panic. These are powerful forces, and some people think these forces need to be controlled. And the moral panic has existed right across history. There's the suspicion of the Minyades, women dancing around Dionysus on the hillside in ancient Greece, or suspicion of the 1960s hippies with their music and drugs and free love. It's interesting to ask what causes this suspicion. For me, I wonder if it's in a patriarchal culture, people are taught the importance of self-control and independence. And as such a patriarchal man, the idea of frenzy, of letting go, of loosening the boundaries of the self, then these are all psychologically toxic. Then add to this the Christian suspicion of sex, we've got a very difficult mixture to deal with. I've spent a lot of time on this topic, but I think it's an important issue, not just for this video, but for my important Switching View project. If you look at these things of queer ministry and shamanism and these techniques of transcendence, they're all given quite a negative moral value by the dominant Christian and patriarchal culture that is very strong in the West and is so strong in our Western scholarship. But if we're going to do our underside of history scholarship properly, we need to be aware of this and be ready to ask the questions: is this moral negativity correct or not? Should we instead ask whether these shaman, these queer ministers, are simply people that use techniques handed down through hundreds, if not many thousands of years, techniques of transcendence that bring their community in touch with the divine and in greater, more spiritual touch with each other? This moral negativity is simply not valid. But having said that, it's now time to move on and move from Siberia to the study of queer ministry in the rest of the pre-patriarchal world. There's some debate as to how and why you have similar examples of shamanism and queer ministry across the world. Do they spread out from one initial source, or did they develop independently in different places? I prefer the theory that they spread out from Siberia over tens of thousands of years, although other theories are available. One route was south. There are reported examples of queer ministry in China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, Borneo, and down into Polynesia. The second route was east, across the Bering Straits and down through all of the Americas, and then south and west into India, Mesopotamia, and Europe. What happened in Africa is more open to question. I want to start off by looking at America for two reasons. Firstly, a lot of this patriarchal takeover only happened in the last 100 or 200 years. There's a huge amount of good quality data that's been gathered to tell us what went on about queer ministry. Firstly, we have reports of the white anthropologists and government workers giving us their view of what was going on. But also we have the memories and records of the indigenous people themselves, carrying their memories forward into the present day. But also secondly, it's not just gender variance, but gender, this whole patriarchy, biarchy issue. As I said in the first video, you can't understand gender variance without also understanding gender, looking at how women were treated and valued in each culture. And so for all of this video and future videos, we're looking at those two issues side by side, both gender and gender variance in some form of intersectionality. So let's start off by looking at gender relationships in North America. As before, I'll talk to the bullet points of the slides, but let you pause the video to read the full text if you want to. European colonists were surprised to find that women in America were physically strong and active alongside the men, playing and enjoying many forms of competitive sport. But women were also economically active alongside the men. In a report from what is now New York State, men hunted while women ran agriculture, and this gave women control over food production, but also their own economic agency. Women also had political agency. In her book, The Patriarchs, Ciani reports how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy managed things in the present day using ideas taken from the past. Women are fully involved in the democratic process, appointing the leaders. And although a male chief was appointed, the chief is responsible to the wider community. Note that final paragraph where the community, not the chief, has the ultimate power. Ciani commented on the paradoxes raised in the 19th century. White women in New York State were actively campaigning for female emancipation and against the patriarchy, whilst indigenous women living in the same area at the same time already had this democratic power. Although Ciani's book is about patriarchy, not queer ministry and gender variance, she did raise the issue. She cited examples of third-gendered people having a valued role in the community, and she cited the anthropologist Evelyn Blackwood, who supported the idea that in a gender egalitarian culture, then gender variance is much more easily accepted. Without a difference in gender status, there are fewer barriers to negotiate. Turning now to look at queer ministry in North America in some detail, I'll be using this book a lot in my work, Changing One's Third and Fourth Genders in Native North America by a guy called Will Roscoe. I'll also be using many other books by him in the videos to come. Will Roscoe is a white homosexual man from America who's gained the confidence of the indigenous third gender people in America, and is a good guy to look out for if you want to learn about these issues. Before we start, there's one question about terminology to take note of. Roscoe uses the term badash in his book, so that's the term I'll be using in this section of the video. Badash is an old European word meaning homosexual, which was used by the early anthropologists to describe these people. But in the almost 30 years since Roscoe's book was published, views have changed, and the word badash is now considered inappropriate. It's better to use terms like third or fourth gender, or two-spirit, which are the terms chosen by the indigenous people themselves, or use words like bote or lamana, which are restricted to a specific indigenous nation. And that leads us on to the next important point. America is a vast continent, not one culture, but many hugely different nations, each with their own language, their own culture, and their own social constructs as to what queer ministry is within that nation. So we'd raise nuanced scholarship, looking for perhaps overall patterns across America as to how these things worked, but also with care and with respect, allowing each nation to be different and have its own ideas as to how things worked. Taking that overall view, Roscoe describes how male sex badash have been documented right across the North American continent. Note that both male and female sex people could cross gender. Whilst male gender variance is often associated with domestic roles and spiritual tasks, female sex people who cross gender often took on the stereotypically male roles of warrior and clan chief. In Roscoe's book, the male sex badash are referred to as third gender, whilst the female sex badash are fourth gender. These badash took on traditional specialised roles and tasks. Some of these are associated with the roles normally filled by the opposite sex, and others may be related specifically to the badash vocation. Badash changed their dress, lifestyle, and ways of speech to match their new vocation. They didn't always dress fully as the opposite gender attempting to pass, but often with a mix of styles reflecting their intermediate position. The badash vocation often appears as an archetype within the mythology of the tribe. And when it comes to love and marriage, relationships are most often with non-badash members of their own sex. A badash vocation often appears well before puberty. It's not a calling related only to a sexual behaviour, but a wider, more holistic call towards the lifestyle of the opposite sex. And whilst many tribes have a mythology of dreams or supernatural intervention in early adult life, this often only confirmed previous behaviours displayed and attitudes displayed by the young person earlier. Sex for a badash could have a recreational or a spiritual value, as well as reinforcing the marriage relationship. There are many reports of male warriors seeking to have sex with a badash, especially a badash warrior, to boost their own courage and fighting ability before battle. Obviously, many Western observers of this sexual behaviour took on a moral panic approach and condemned this sexual licence. But some observers gave a more balanced approach, saying that indigenous morals were simply different, but not lacking. It's worth paying attention to this slide in some detail, looking at the Crow Nation. In a matrilineal culture, where a child knows its own mother and its own wider family, and inheritance passes down the female line, then the child is cared for perfectly well within the wider family without needing to know the identity of the father. This allowed for a more relaxed attitude to sex, or even a positive attitude to sex. Sex could be for reproductive reasons, but non-reproductive sex could have its own value in pleasure, in emotional connection, and in forging relationships. And because matrilineal systems allow a more relaxed attitude to sex, then the same positive attitude to sex and love could be lived out by third and fourth gender people. Sex for love, for pleasure, sex to reinforce the marriage relationship, but also for a badash, sex for a spiritual purpose. Turning now to the badash's specialist tasks, this is a partial list from Roscoe's book of some of what they did, but it varied hugely from nation to nation. Each different culture would have its own idea as to what it was appropriate for a badash to do or not to do. For some, they were the shamanic practices of inducing trance and transcendence and vision, and of conducting the rituals involved. But not all spirituality involved trance. Not all badashes were shaman. There could be different forms of divination or magic, or the interpretation of dreams. One thing that comes up again and again is the importance of, in some way, suggesting auspicious names for children. There was nearly always the need to work alongside women, and badash were hugely popular because of their masculine strength, because they weren't taken repeatedly out of action through childbirth. They could also be specialists in arts and crafts. Again, with their additional strength, and without being taken out of action through childbirth, they could become deep specialists and experts. For something to be made like a badash was often a mark of quality. In some tribes, badash were involved in death and burial in various ways. But also in many tribes, there's an almost non-spiritual role as a counsellor, advisor, and mediator. Because of their position, they could liaise between the men and the women, or represent the tribe to other people. And finally, there are various roles in warfare, the roles depending on the tribe. But before I finish, let me give you two case studies of badash people, so you can put a face and a name to the sorts of people I have been talking about. The person on the left in fine women's clothing is Osh Tish, also known as Squaw Jim or Woman Jim. Squaw Jim is a Crow Nation bote or badash. We actually have Osh Tish's recorded words in an interview late in his life from 1919. When asked how long have you acted as a woman, she said she inclined to be a woman, never a man. I have done it ever since I can remember because I wanted to do it. My father and mother did not like it. They used to whip me, take away my girls' clothes and put boys' clothes on me. But I threw them away and got girls' clothes and dolls to play with. Osh Tish persevered, however, and became a badash and took on a woman's role and eventually became a skilled leather worker and tent maker. Oshtish is also famed for the courage in battle. As a young person in 1876, she fought in the Battle of the Rosebud, one of the significant battles in the campaign that ended in Custer's last stand 8 days later. There were reports that 3 Quo women took part in the battle. One of them was Oshtish, who acquired the name, finds them and kills them. We don't know for certain who the person on the right is. There may be one of the other women who fought in the battle, named the Other Magpie. This story illustrates that third gender role. Oshtish was free to act both like a woman and like a man, in the kitchen or on the battlefield, not limited to one gender only. When it comes to spirituality, a Bhoti like Oshtish fitted within the mythology of the Quo nation and took on specialist roles. Only a Bardash could erect the large central pole of the ceremonial lodge in the sun dance, because the pole was, symbolically, the conduit between the dancers and the Sun Father. And Oshtish was also a powerful shaman-type figure. As a result of a vision in her youth, she was known as having the power to mediate between the spiritual and the human realm. I've chosen this second example partly to show the geographic spread of similar ideas across the continent. This is Wewa, a Bardash who lived in the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, southwest USA, in the 19th century. There's a fantastic full-length study and biography of Wewa written by Will Roscoe. It's worth emphasising that for the Zuni people, like for the Quo nation and the Haudenosaunee people, it's this same matrilineal system that gave both women and third gender people control over their own lives and bodies. Like Oshtish, Wewa showed a choice for girls' activities in very early childhood, but this was affirmed and accepted by the Zuni tribe. And so older, Wewa took on a woman's role and became skilled in weaving and basket making. Wewa fitted into the spiritual archetype of the Zuni mythology as a lamana. Here you can see a wall painting showing the combined genders, bow and long hair of a warrior on one side, a basket and short hair the other. And Bardash, like Wewa, wore masks showing the same gender combination in the tribe's rituals and processions. Wewa's main role was as a counsellor and advisor, almost a statesman, liaising between the men and women within the Zuni tribe, but also leading the tribe when in conflict with government forces over land use, at one time being imprisoned for what they did, and at another time going on a 6-month sort of PR offensive to Washington. I can't leave the story of third and fourth gender people in America without bringing the story up to date. You would have noticed that a lot of the reports I've used have been from the mid-19th century, recent enough to get good quality documented research, but far enough back in time to have escaped the worst of the patriarchal suppression and destruction. But even then, Roscoe reports that some tribes had already been destroyed or suppressed. But it has to be said that between 1850 and 1950, there was a huge state-led, deliberate suppression of indigenous culture, a culture that has been described in more recent reports, both in Canada and the USA, as cultural genocide. There were law changes in the late 19th century, changing the marriage status of women to be dependent on men and outlawing homosexuality. There was a huge loss of tribal land, but most catastrophically, the forced education of indigenous children in state or church-run schools. In these schools, the children were given a Christian education and taught to be ashamed of their parents' moral values, and especially ashamed of homosexual Bardash culture. Over a century, a rich indigenous culture that existed right across the continent became hugely degraded. Interviewed in 1919, the Quo Bote Oshtish said she was the only Bardash left. All the others that she knew of were dead and far back in history. I'll mention in passing this superb website set up by Mount Allison University in Canada. It's a distance learning package teaching women of the Mi'kmaq Nation in Canada about their own past history and freedom, and then about the colonial story and about their suppression and genocide. If you want to find one single resource to learn about colonial suppression, then look at this one. It's superb. Or there's this Canadian government report and Introduction to the Health of Two-Spirit People. Two-Spirit is the Canadian equivalent of third and fourth gender. Again, it discusses the lives of Indigenous people before, during and after the colonial takeover, focusing on the mental and physical damage caused to Two-Spirit people by colonialism. And this is the sort of information I can link you to if you look at the text and resources section of my website. There is, however, some good news amongst the tragedy. In the past few decades, campaigners, researchers, both white and indigenous, have been working together to recover what memories they can. A huge amount has been lost forever, but some memories remain. So I'll leave the last word to Harry Hay. Harry is an American queer campaigner and researcher. In the second half of his life, he was one of the first to bring this third and fourth gender culture to public attention. I think it's fair to say that Harry was Edward Carpenter's disciple, and Will Roscoe's mentor, was one of my own heroes. And through his life, Harry was trying to answer, on behalf of homosexual people, these three questions. Who are we? What are we for? And how do we, as homosexuals, relate to our parent society responsibly and as a group? And in his work researching the third and fourth gender people in these American indigenous cultures, Harry found a lot of the answers he was searching for.
That's what I used to do. I would read the stuff over and over again until all of a sudden I would find a word that kept sticking in my mind. This is how I came across the word Berdache. Berdache was something particular about the magical person. He lived together with other Berdache. They seemed to be what we call sissy men. And I was starting to think, that's me, that's me, that's me.
The Berdache, or Two-Spirit people, were honored members of many North American tribes. Combining male and female traits, they performed sacred ceremonies and passed on arts traditions. Harry's discovery of the Berdache radically confirmed his belief that gay people played a crucial role in the world.
We are men not for killing and men not for war. We're not men for being husbandmen. So therefore we're thought of as a third gender. And as a third gender, we have in a way, as we have with quite a number of tribes here in the North American continent, we are given the responsibility of keeping the men and the women in balance. And because if we keep the men and women in balance, if we do that well, we're honored and we're rewarded and we're loved. But we are a different people and a different way of relating. And we have been able to make wonderful contributions to many other people in the past.
Harry comes at this clearly from a homosexual and white background. But whatever your background, whether you're white or indigenous or anywhere else in the world, whether you are homosexual or trans or anywhere else on the LGBTQIA spectrum, Harry asks an important question. What is our value in the world? What is our purpose? Why are we here? And if you look at work like Harry did and many others on these third and fourth gender people in America, then there clearly is an answer. Yes, we do have a value. Yes, we do have a great purpose. And for any of us in the modern world who are LGBTQIA, that's a very good thing to hear. I've spent a huge amount of time on this North American story, but I hope that has been helpful. Not just to tell the story of third and fourth gender lives, but also to show how these lives fitted into the wider gender egalitarian matrilineal culture, and also to defend their sexual and erotic lives from a Christian moral panic, to make the point that these morals weren't lacking, just different. But I now need to move on to a much faster tour around the rest of the world. All I have time for is to make the point that these queer ministry lives were being lived out almost everywhere one looks. Moving first into South America, the colonial patriarchal takeover was with the conquistadors way back in the 15th and 16th century, and so the records of what happened are much patchier and more complex to interpret. Having said that, in Mesoamerica, or Middle America, we've got some good documentation. In the Aztec or Nahau culture, Nahau converts to Christianity produced a 2,500-page illustrated guide to their culture, history and religion, called the Codex Florentine, and other texts also exist. From these texts, it seems that in deep prehistory, that women held political power and fought as warriors, and effeminate men spent their days weaving, painting, singing and dancing. But then in the 9th century CE, a more patriarchal, militaristic Aztec culture developed, and over time this gender variance was suppressed. By the time of the Christian arrival, gender variant people were being tortured and killed. In this image from the Florentine Codex, the man on the left is in masculine clothing, whilst the one on the right is in feminine attire and has knotted hair braids, possibly linked to the goddess Xochiquetzal. The text linked to these images uses words like sodomite and womanish. The second image shows that same person being burnt to death. But despite this homophobic surface culture, Connors quotes reports that there was a hidden don't ask, don't tell type subculture in which queer ministry type activities were able to flourish. Gender variant men served alongside women in the temple, and there was widespread popular belief that such practices and such people were divinely sanctioned. For example, the goddess Xochitl, among her other attributes, is linked to gender variance, homoeroticism, and spiritual activity. The word Hirajul literally means holy servant, and is often used to describe somebody serving the god or goddess in some form of erotic or sexual ritual. Gender variance in the temple also appears elsewhere in South America. Further south in Peru, the conquistador and writer Chiesa de Leon found gender variant holy servants serving in temples and houses of worship. That description, attired like women even from childhood, now sounds quite familiar. And the moral panic, blaming it all on the devil, is also familiar. Finally, let me give you a fascinating quote from the 18th century Jesuit scholar Joseph Lafitau. He seems to be doing exactly the same sort of cross-cultural comparison that I am doing 3 centuries later. He compares gender variance in Mesoamerican temples to the worshippers of Cybele and other goddesses in ancient times. This is a marble relief from 2nd century Rome showing an actual worshipper of Cybele. These two were gender variant men who sometimes castrated themselves in service of the goddess. You can see the female clothing, long hair and jewellery, and surrounding the image, the musical instruments that were the tools of her trade. I find it fascinating that Joseph Lafitau could suggest that gender variant connection across continents and across centuries. Turning now to Africa, it's important I discuss what's going on there, but sadly the picture there is much more complicated. Firstly, like North America, it's a huge continent with not just one culture, but many different cultures. But other things have complicated the picture. The Christian involvement in some places, the standard colonial suppression of the last 200 years, but in other places like Ethiopia, the involvement with Christianity goes back almost to the beginning of that religion. In other parts, you've got the involvement of Islam complicating the issue, and then in other areas, which are very militaristic, you have this warrior love, age-structured homosexuality being very prevalent, and again, that simply complicates the issue. So the overall picture of queer ministry in Africa is much less well documented and much less well understood, which is a pity. It's a fascinating place. But all I can do again in this video is document a few case studies. And again, it almost goes without saying nowadays that in Africa, like elsewhere, these queer ministry spiritual lives were often lived out in cultures where women had positions of authority and power. In Nigeria, in the Yoruba religion, we're told that all priests address as women, whatever their actual sex. There's evidence of homoerotic activity involved in spiritual practice. Elsewhere, in Ghana, again, homoerotic sexual practice is part of spiritual life. Before the arrival of Islam in the Sahel, then we are told that transgender men are part of the erotic spiritual life. In his fantastic book, Sex and Religion, Dag Osten-Ensjog gives us a long catalogue of many other parts of Africa with the same correlation of gender variance, homoerotic activities and spirituality. And Randy Connor gives a similarly long list in his book, Blossom of Bone. I don't have time to list them all here, but I do want to make time to briefly discuss the cross-cultural link between Africa and America. A huge number of African slaves were transported to the Americas, and when they got there, they found new religious practices, but practices that included gender variant and homoerotic activity, which harmonized with what they knew from back home. And so new syncretic spiritualities developed, which merged these ideas from the New World with those from the Old. The Yoruba religion, which started in Nigeria, is widespread across parts of America, and Haitian voodoo is also a product of this merger. Both involve gender variance and homoerotic activity. Because what happened in the Aztec Mesoamerican culture is better documented, we can give more details there. We even know that back in 1624, the Paya dance drama, celebrating an aspect of the goddess Xochitl, was led by a black slave going by the name of Perret, who was dressed as a woman and with long, false hair. Our next stop on the world journey is India, where again we will see much that we recognise, but a few things that are different. Like elsewhere, there are many different gender variant identities and constructs across a huge continent, but I'll talk about the Hijira, which are the best known grouping. Hijira are male sex, but mostly either female identifying or third gender. They're mostly Hindu, associated with the goddess Bhujara Mata. A lot of the legends about this goddess involve physical or gender transformation to avoid danger, and so she's become the patron goddess of the gender transforming Hijira community. Some Hijira undergo voluntary castration to follow this example of physical transformation. In the present day, Hijira are associated with folk spiritual roles, dancing at weddings and bestowing blessings. But Hijira have an ambivalent reputation nowadays. They're also associated with prostitution and begging. And because many are rejected by their birth families, they often live in chosen family groups, led by a guru or teacher. As always, we need to stand back and look at the entire social context and not study these Hijira people in isolation. Like elsewhere, India has a long history of matrilineal culture, which is still quite strong in the south. And Saini's book has some fascinating stuff about these Indian cultures, if you're interested. But also, like elsewhere, in India, the British colonial system imposed changes and pressured these people to follow Victorian Christian values. Again, the major transformation was in the late 19th and early 20th century. In 1861, homosexuality was outlawed. In 1871, the Hijira culture was declared habitually criminal and became subject to registration and legal control. In 1897, that law was modified to remove children from such communities and to create reformatory settlements like the mission schools elsewhere across the colonial world. It's interesting to compare this Hijira data with data gathered from elsewhere. Elsewhere, like in Africa or America, you've got these gender variant people with quite a high status, but that's data gathered before the colonial takeover from the 18th century and before that. But here in India, we've got data gathered in the present day where these gender variant people have got a much more ambivalent low status. There's a huge amount of data about these Hijira people, but this is work gathered by ethnographers looking at gender relationships, or perhaps health promotion professionals studying prostitution. It's incredibly valuable work, but doesn't answer questions that we are looking at about spirituality. And the question for us is, if these Hijira have a low status nowadays, what happened in the past before colonialism? Do they have a higher status then, like elsewhere? Sadly, there's not a lot to go on in terms of hard data. But some people suggest that if we look at the myths and legends of Hinduism, that might give us that window into the past and show us how gender variant people were regarded in times gone by. Let's look at the Mahabharata as a sort of case study. The Mahabharata is a major Hindu text. It's a sort of narrative theology. It transmits Hindu morals and values within an epic, heroic story. As far as scholars can tell, the setting is North India, about the 10th century BCE, but compiled into one document many centuries later. The story tells us about gods and legendary heroes. The scholars argue that these stories can reflect the values and thinking of the human culture at the time the stories came into being. If you look carefully at the Mahabharata, it's clear there's a patriarchal overview, but gender variant and matrilineal values are not far below the surface. There's the Swayamvara ritual, where a high-status woman, like a princess, is able to select her own husband from a gathering of eligible hopefuls. And the story of Sudyumna. Like Tiresias, a Greek legend, he disturbed two gods making love in a forest, and his punishment from then on changed gender back and forth with the phases of the moon. There's the story of Arjuna, the principal hero of the entire Mahabharata epic. When he and his brothers needed to hide for a year, he disguised himself as the eunuch Prihanala in the court of King Varata and became a dancing teacher to the king's daughter. And finally, the story of Arjuna's son, Aravan. Aravan offered his own life to ensure victory for his side in battle. He asked only for one night of passion with a woman before death, but no woman would grant that favour. So out of respect and compassion, Lord Krishna himself transitioned to a female avatar named Mohini to grant his request. These are complex arguments. You can't give definite black and white answers. You have to apply nuance and care. But if you look carefully at the story, I think it's possible to make the argument that underneath this patriarchal overview is a second story, perhaps a bit more hidden, where gender variant and homoerotic stories and values were treated with respect and given value. What is happening to the Hegiras in the present day did not reflect how they were valued in the past. The final jigsaw piece in our survey of queer ministry across the world is to ask what happened in Europe. And there we have a problem with access to records. In many parts of the world, the colonial takeover and the patriarchal suppression of biarchy happened quite recently, and so we have good records. But in Europe, the patriarchal takeover happened with a Roman invasion 2,000 years ago. And since then, we've had the Roman, post-Roman Christian cultures suppressing all forms of queer ministry. But what happened before that? Sadly, we have very little written text to go on, and so it's hard to interpret what happened. But recently, some advances in archaeology, especially the ability to tell the sex of skeletons, has shown some interesting lights on what may have happened in those pre-Roman cultures in Europe. Let me talk about one project, a dig in Dorset, southwest England, only 50 miles away from where I am sitting making this recording here today. The archaeologists showed that this community was matrilocal over several generations. Married men moved to live with their wife's family in the community. And as we have seen, a matrilocal culture is associated with women having significant freedom and authority. But those findings back up other things we know about this culture. High status, wealthy graves were the graves of women and not men. And we have the records of Queen Boudica, the Celtic warrior queen who fought the Romans somewhere near London. And we have surviving Roman texts describing how women in Britain were quite powerful. And this was seen by the Romans as a sign of British backwardness, unlike the cultured but deeply patriarchal invading state. As an example of this Roman commentary, the historian Diodorus Siculus wrote, "The women of the Celts are nearly as tall as the men, and they rival them also in courage." Whilst Marcelin wrote, "A whole group of foreigners would not be able to withstand a single Celt in a fight if he called his wife to assistance." And as a possible example of such a Celtic woman, this is a 3rd century BCE gravesite in Wetwang, North Yorkshire. The woman's high status is shown by her age. She died about 45 years old, when the average lifespan was 25, and she was significantly taller than average. Perhaps the best sign of her status is that the decorations on her chariot were made of red coral. The nearest source of that is the Red Sea in Arabia. So turning from gender to gender variance and queer ministry, if my theories are correct, we should expect to find clearer evidence of queer ministry, intermediate-type people, gender variance in these graves alongside the significant examples of matrilineal cultures. Sadly, the evidence is less clear. There's not so much there to be found. But there could be a reason for that. Firstly, these theories about queer ministry and gender variance are quite recent. And so older excavations, the archaeologists may have missed the clues or misread the clues that are there to be found. Or it may be that the markers of male gender are metallic, swords and spears, and last well in graves. But the markers of a female gender are organic and decay much more rapidly, textiles and bone and ivory. But there are some examples to be found. Let me talk about one excavation from Dover, southeast England, from the Anglo-Saxon period. This is after the Roman occupation, in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries after Christ. The Buckland site was a huge Anglo-Saxon cemetery with over 160 graves, but there are two of particular interest to us. Grave 30 contains a male skeleton showing evidence of high status and good nutrition through life. But the skeleton was buried with jewellery normally found with female sexed bodies, combs, brooches, beads, pendants, and so on. A set of iron keys may signify ownership of significant property. For some scholars, this grave is evidence of what we would today call a transgender life. But when similar gender-variant graves also contain things like beads and mirrors, other scholars have suggested an association with divination and spirituality. And then grave 96 is a double burial with two skeletons. The first body is male, aged 40, the second younger. It wasn't possible to tell the sex of the skeleton from the bones, but both bodies were buried with weapons. In the dig report, Vera Everson said they were probably both warriors of noble rank. And for her, this raised the possibility that homosexuality was socially acceptable for Anglo-Saxons, and that's why they were buried together. For me, the age difference brings up ideas around the age-structured homosexuality and warrior love I've talked about in other videos. Personally, I think it very likely that these expressions of homosexuality and queer ministry were very active and very visible and quite accepted in these periods in Britain and Northern Europe. Just that finding the evidence archaeologically is difficult in the absence of written texts. But hopefully, as scientific techniques improve in archaeology, and as archaeologists become more aware of the issues of gender and gender variance, then more evidence will appear in the future. But before I leave this subject of Europe, let me just talk about Neolithic cave paintings. And in those caves, then the evidence of queer ministry is much more explicit and there to be seen. So the cave in Lascaux, southwest France, is an image of a man and a bison and a bird. An image that brings up thoughts about the shamanism we discussed earlier with its animistic spirituality. The man possibly in a trance. The man and possibly the bison have enlarged and aroused sexual organs. Then the famous cave of the three brothers, images of three men dancing, one with antlers and two in bison masks. And again, all the men have prominently drawn sexual organs. And then in Sicily, you've got a group of bird-masked naked male figures dancing around two men on the ground. These two men, plus two of the other dancers, have erect sexual organs or penis sheaths. And there's clear homoerotic positioning. The question is, how do you interpret these images? Older scholarship, from a time when sexuality was shameful, suggested this was a human sacrifice or a fertility ritual. But for fertility, you'd expect women to be present. For a more gay-friendly view, you can contrast these images with the beliefs and practices of Indigenous peoples recorded more recently. It's possible, I think, to look at these and argue that these are clearly homoerotic, but also possibly some form of initiation or group bonding, or possibly some form of shamanic transcendent ritual, or possibly both together, and therefore they would clearly fit inside my own definition of queer ministry. I think it's worth paying attention to these stories of queer ministry or hierarchy within Europe. Wherever you live in the world, it's very affirming for those of us who are LGBTQIA to look back within your own culture, to find examples in history where people like you were able to flourish and to live their lives freely. But for many people in, for example, Africa or the Pacific Islands or the Americas, you only have to look back 200 years, as we discussed, to find these stories. But for those of us in Europe, we have to look back a lot further, and the data is a lot sketchier. But it is there. If you look in Celtic Britain at gender relations and biarchy, now you have the stories of the very powerful Abbess Hilda or St. Bridget in Ireland, stories of very dominant, powerful women. Or there's the pagan legends of Queen Maeve in the Tane legends. Looking at homosexuality or intermediate types, the data is sketchier, but you have the clear gender variants in the Norse Scandinavian mythologies. So again, it's possible to make arguments. And the data is building up. So if you look back far enough with care, I think it's possible for those of us living in Britain and Europe to find stories where women had independence and power, and where intermediate type people and queer ministers were able to live and flourish and be welcomed as part of the community. We've now come to the end of the second queer ministry video. I'm not going to say much in the way of analysis. We are all different, come from different backgrounds. You need to take away from this video what's important for you personally. So I want to mention those two things in passing. The first thing is to re-emphasize how important it is to understand the history of patriarchy and biarchy when studying queer ministry or intermediate type lives. That link is so important, I've turned it into Simon Dawson's first law. Biarchal cultures, which display gender equality, often accept and welcome intermediate type and queer ministry lives. Patriarchal cultures tend to suppress intermediate type and queer ministry lives. It used to be thought that patriarchy, with the accompanying homophobia, was a universal human condition through history, but we now know that is not the case. The other question is, why was there this link between intermediate type people and spirituality? What caused so many people right across the world to get involved in religion and spirituality when they have these homoerotic or gender variant lives? That's a fascinating question, much too deep and detailed to get into in this video, but I will discuss it on the website. So look out for sections in my website labelled Discussion, Definitions and Laws, where I can explore in much more detail the sorts of things I've been talking about on videos like this. But what I will tell you briefly is where we're going next, the next 3 videos in this queer ministry series. The first video and this video are sort of phase 1, looking at stories of queer ministry outside patriarchy and Christianity. And for many people that will be enough. Simply hearing stories where intermediate lives and queer ministry vocations have been valued and affirmed within your own community, wherever you live in the world, has been affirming, and that's fine. But the next 3 videos in the series are taking this learning into a study of Judaism and Christianity. I'll be doing what Harry Hay did in his North American research, a sort of pattern recognition.
You can lift the printed page and you can see the shadows behind. And it's the shadows behind where the stories are. And that's what I used to do. I would read the stuff over and over again until all of a sudden I would find a word that kept sticking in my mind. This is how I came across the word berdash. And I suddenly think, that's me, that's me, that's me.
I think what we've learned from this video is that if you look at gender variance or homoerotic behaviour linked to a spiritual vocation, there are clearly patterns to be seen right across the world and right across history. So what we'll be doing is looking at Jewish and Christian scriptures and the story of Jewish and Christian faith development and looking for those same patterns. And I'll be arguing that these patterns are clearly there to be seen. There are a huge number of stories where gender variance or homoerotic behaviour are clearly associated with people who are important in these scriptural narratives. Jewish and Christian scripture and the Jewish and Christian faith stories are much more strange, much more sexual, much more queer than many people might think. And that's what I'll be talking about in the next 3 videos in this series. Until then, goodbye. We've now come to the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it interesting. Before I sign off, just a few reminders. If you go to the switchingview.com website, you'll find a schedule of all the videos I have uploaded and plan to upload. You'll also find a link to the text and resources document where I list all the evidence I've used in this video and some recommendations for further reading if you want to follow things up for yourself. Don't forget to click like and subscribe if you want YouTube to send you further videos like this one. And finally, can I ask you a favour? I've put a lot of work into these videos. I want them to be seen by the largest number of people. So if you have a friend or a colleague who you think would be interested, please do pass it on. Please do spread the word. That's all for now. Thank you.